Hello, everybody. Welcome. So my name is Marzia, and I'm the Intelligence Director at Transformers Foundation. Transformers Foundation is the unified voice representing the denim industry and its ideas for positive change. And I really wanted to thank you to everybody that is attending for taking the time to join us and learn more about how to debunk myths, fact check, and use data responsibly. So if you're here today, you probably have seen the paper that we released last week, which covers the fashion industry misinformation issue using cotton claims as our case study. And I would recommend that if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so. And the link, I believe that Annie shared it in our chat box. And but mostly what we tried to do with our work through this work was to create a resource that helps the fashion industry strengthen its critical data consumption skills, such as mentioned, fact check claims, locate primary sources, understand and be critical with the role that data and statistics have in society, but mostly to slow down and reverse these problems that we have. And that's exactly why we're here today. Just so I can talk you through some of the technical side of things of this workshop learning session. You can put any questions that you have on the Q&A box, and we'll address them, as many as possible, at the end of our session and throughout our session. And so today is divided into two parts. The first part is going to be a mini workshop on fact-checking. And after, we're going into a more open panel discussion. So after all this introduction, I just wanted to get started. And so I want to welcome with us our first guest expert, Allison. If you can, hello, Allison, nice to have you.
Hi, thank you for having me today. It's really great to be with you this morning.
It's an honor to have you. Can you please just briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Allison Deger. I'm a fact checker on this project. I'm a journalist with about 10 years of experience. I've fact checked for books, news, and features, working with publishers like Random House and Simon & Schuster.
Great, amazing. And just before we get started, because, I've been introduced to the concept of fact checking not that many years ago. So I wanted to make sure that everybody knows what fact checking is. So if you can share with us what is actually fact checking, what does it mean?
Sure. In its most simplistic form, fact-checking is independent verification of reported facts. The level of detail that we confirm in this process can be as small as the spelling of names or as nuanced as determining if an argument is based on accurate characterizations of data and, of course, accurate data. Much of the practice today is rooted in journalistic principles that were hammered out in the US around the turn of the century when yellow journalism and muckraking was rooted out and publications needed to earn the trust of their readers. Initially, fact-checking departments were the purview of magazines, but have since spread and are of cross-publication industries. You'll see dedicated departments within newspapers and magazines today, but many organizations do not have staff fact checkers and will thus employ them internally or externally. For this purpose, I'm considered an external fact checker or third-party verification. Usually professional fact checkers undergo about 6 months of training before being let loose in the world to work with different organizations or magazines. As a fact checker, I strive to ensure work is as error-free as possible, and that means often re-interviewing subjects, pulling data from government clearinghouses, and anticipating problems. We correct errors transparently and apply scrutiny to all of the text that we handle.
Yeah. Thank you, Allison. And I must say that in Allison's role in the paper that we just released was really crucial to make sure that we were being as accurate as possible with our work. And I think you know, your experience with all these connections, different stakeholders such as like governments, etc., was really, really important actually to strengthen our work. So, but I wanted also to just take a step back and like to understand actually how does it actually work, this process of as you said, like fact checking.
What we do is we look at every single letter and every single word of the text, and we verify if it is accurate. What we're doing in terms of information is we're looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary sources to determine the veracity of the data point. So primary sources is any kind of source where there is direct knowledge of the subject matter. Sometimes this is an original quote. Sometimes these are our clunky data sets that we pull from a government or from an international institution. Secondary sources are often locations where that primary source has been presented. And if that secondary source is cited, it's considered a credible source, but sometimes secondary sources do not credit their primary source or errors are placed in, and at times the secondary sources are quite credible, and that helps facilitate some of this misinformation problem. Tertiary sources are when you have a newspaper article that quotes another newspaper article that quotes another newspaper article, and with each copy, invariably errors are introduced. And we really only use those if we're talking about something like, can we verify that there's a popular discussion around something? Yes, a tertiary source was published, but we do not use them as credible sources. But a lot of organizations who don't rely on deep fact checking can't distinguish between each of these, and we'll move to use a tertiary instead of taking that extra time to reselect the data set from the primary source.
And I'm guessing like some people say, okay, why is this so important to fact check and to have a third-party fact checker?
It's a mechanism that publications can use to ensure the veracity of their claims. Just as an anecdote, in my 10 years of fact checking, there's only one individual that I worked for that had 0 errors in her text, and that's because she employs an independent fact checker to work for her. And so before she would submit it to another fact checker, the most common types of errors we find is a transposition of a letter or a number. So if you're dealing with a large volume of text, invariably that's going to happen. What we consider an error can be quite minute, but can have a dramatic impact. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and I think we've covered that slightly in our report. We call it erratic copying in the case of the of our report. But I wanted to get into the exercise because I think some people may think, oh my God, this is so hard to do. Primary, tertiary, secondary sources, what does it mean? So maybe, Annie, if you can share the slides so we can go through the exercise with Allison and that we prepared for everybody so we can really learn some of the skills that Allison has and apply on our everyday communication of claims. So here is just a quick screenshot of some of the work that we've done in the paper. We vetted a widely circulated claim that was about insecticides and actually also pesticides used on cotton. So you've probably seen it on the web that some organizations claim, or some marketing claims that 25% of the words insecticide are used on cotton, or in its various form. It says 25% of pesticides in on some website, 16 of pesticides or insecticides, and these two terminologies are used interchangeably. I don't want to go deeper into the finding of our paper. You can check it on the link that we've linked in the chat. But for the sake of the exercise today, we've decided to unpick the 16% of all pesticides are used on cotton figure. with Allison. So Annie, can you please go to the next slide? So this is a widely circulated report from 2017 that stated this claim. And so with Allison, we're going to go through how would we approach fact-checking. Allison, over to you. Can you talk us through the process of, how would we fact-check this?
Yes, so this is a great exercise for showing how we invalidate claims, which is generally the approach that we use in fact checking. We assume that we can poke holes in everything and we dive into it. So this is a report from a credible institution that has used footnotes to get to two different numbers relating to pesticide use for cotton. Their footnotes, we found one that uses the 11% number, 11% of all pesticides.
If in the next slide, sorry, I mean, we have these referring, yeah. Great.
One uses the 11% number, as you can see, and the other one rolls over to the Rodale Institute, and that uses the 16% number. So let's start with 11%. What I found from that, I pulled it up, there was a chapter behind a paywall from a peer-reviewed journal that gets the 2 million tons of pesticides consumed. However, what that original source is about is global pesticide sales, not consumption. So those are two different things. And it actually doesn't mention cotton at all in the report. It doesn't, for that matter, it doesn't mention any primary crops. It's not about crops. It's about pesticide sales in that time period. But there's no sourcing, even though it's peer reviewed. So that's highly suspect. The second one for the Rodale Institute, can we flip the slide?
Yeah.
Perfect. So when we clicked that, we saw that it wasn't up. So that's the oops. Couldn't find this article, but never mind. The internet is forever. So we popped it in the Wayback Machine to see what was this original source that this credible secondary source used. And we found the original source is a blog post that's then been taken down. So a blog post wouldn't constitute a primary source. We couldn't use that in fact checking, and certainly something that has been taken down. Oftentimes when posts are taken down, it's one of two things. Either the site has made changes and they're updating the data that they're carrying, or the second is that there's a quiet retraction of the data that they had on their site, and we can usually find out by contacting the organization. But in any regard, a blog post that's been removed, no, we wouldn't say that constitutes a viable primary source.
Great. Thank you so much for working through these exercise. And Allison, what I think it's important here is that we can all, it sounds for me that is super accessible. I've done this exercise myself when I was doing the research for the paper. We've also worked together towards vetting some other claims that we used. And so it's as simple as trying to find the primary source for this, right? And really understand what that primary source tells you, not just relying on a, how do you call it, tertiary source. Yeah, thank you for that. And so now we are, I'm very excited about this exercise. I hope that you've all learned a little bit and you've taken some learning with you. And in our paper page, I think it's page 52, we've included a fact-checking exercise that you can also use to train your fact-checking skills. But I'm mostly excited actually now for the second part of our panel, which is with the two additional experts. One is Terry Townsend and the other one is Elizabeth Klein. Please, I'm really honored to welcome them to the panel. Hi, Elizabeth, who's the co-author of this report, and Terry, who supported us with the revision of the report. So Terry, if you can briefly introduce yourself. I'm sure that many people here know you already, but for the ones that don't.
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised a lot of people don't. My name is Terry Townsend. I live in Houston, the center of the American petrochemical industry. And so I'm glad to be talking to people with an interest in cotton. I spent 33 years collecting statistics and writing, traveling the world to producing countries, and just learning about the cotton industry. I spent my career was with the International Cotton Advisory Committee. Thank you.
An honor to have you here, really. Elizabeth, for the ones that don't know you.
Yeah, it's so good to be here. My name is Elizabeth Klein. I'm a journalist, the author of 2 books about sustainability and labor rights in fashion. The first was called Overdressed, and then more recently I put out a book called The Conscious Closet. I'm also the advocacy and policy director at Remake. That's a more recent development. So I come at this project from the experience of both an advocate and someone who's experienced misinformation on the journalism side as well.
Great. And it was so good to work on this paper together because you brought really like a different perspective to it. And but I want to start with a warm-up question. Going around all the 3 of you, on a scale of 1 to 100, how much of a threat to society do you think is the use of inaccurate data, and also why? Elizabeth, let me start with you.
I mean, I think that putting a number to that is probably not, I mean, based on our findings in the report, right? It's like, I wouldn't quantify it. But what I would say is that one of the paper's big takeaways is that fashion misinformation, it's something that most of us are aware of, but maybe haven't taken seriously enough because it wasn't necessarily connected back to society's larger information disorder. And as we say in the paper, it has very serious and growing consequences. So yeah, I know we're going to get more into that, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And Terry?
And like Elizabeth, I find it hard to quantify, but I was going to say I would put it at 50, 0 to 100, because it's a huge problem, but it's not the only huge problem. And so I'm not sure. I wouldn't put it at 100. It's not the worst problem, but it's somewhere in the middle. And it certainly distorts decision making. It creates a structure of incentives that undermines what economists call virtuous behavior. We're not talking about morals here, but behavior that results in improvement. And so this problem is serious. It's pervasive throughout our society, not just the cotton industry, but cotton is an interesting case study.
Thank you, Terry. And Allison, as a fact checker, so how much of a threat to society is the use of inaccurate data, and why?
I consistently see the same inaccurate data sets used over and over in legitimate legacy publications to draw larger political conclusions. And we know from research that we've seen that it's really challenging to correct misinformation, even when it's presented in a sober, detailed account. And so I think that is one of the more difficult parts of it is even when there is a fact check, opinions often don't change.
Right. Thank you, everybody. I think if I can add to you and to all the comments that we made is actually like the distortion of decision making that I find the most threatening to our objectivity. So a question to all. I think that we all agree that fashion has a misinformation problem, but where do you think it comes from, and what are the root causes of that? Elizabeth, again, this is on, I want to start with you.
Yeah, it's interesting because Allison and I had a conversation about this as we were fact checking the paper, because my understanding was that it was primarily being fueled by, digital tools, social media. Once misinformation is out there, misinformation is not new, but the speed at which it can travel is unprecedented. And it's also, to Allison's point, very difficult once it's out there to get it back. I think that there are some unique reasons why fashion has a misinformation problem, and I would be really interested to hear what the other panelists think. You know, one of our stakeholders mentioned that they think that it's probably because brands are often asked to communicate about sustainability in cotton when they're mostly creatives and entrepreneurs. They don't necessarily have a scientific background, but the public and investors are increasingly asking them to weigh in on sustainability, be sustainable, and they're wading into waters they don't often feel comfortable with. But I know Allison has a lot of really interesting information about the origins of misinformation that she can add to the conversation.
Right, that's on that's for Allison then.
Yeah.
When we were looking into how misinformation spreads, we're really familiar with seeing it on social media, and that's what grabs our attention. But we actually learned that it's just quite a small number of social media users that are spreading it and consuming it, and that it's really, social media is really a mechanism to volley it into mainstream media. And so once the misinformation gets picked up to television, which still constitutes the primary way most people consume news, I think we found the Pew study was about 60%. But keep in mind, social media has surpassed newspapers. So, that's still quite a large role there. Once it's in newspaper, once it's on television, that's how it really becomes pervasive and locked in.
It's super interesting.
I would also add that there's a certain momentum to it now. Like we talk in the paper, or maybe this is just a conversation we've had behind the scenes, is that some of us, in journalism in particular, I've been aware that there was an erosion of standards, but it's kind of like no one really stopped and took stock and said, hey, when did this happen? When did we cross over from, fact checking being completely standard in the way of the industry to now where freelance writers in particular are often asked to do their own fact checking. If they make a mistake, the liability is completely on the writer. It was kind of just like this transition that we all sort of sleptwalked into, and now everyone's kind of taking stock and being like, wow, we really have a problem, not just in fashion, but across media and society that we need to address.
Yeah, and you, Terry, as an expert on cotton, like what's your take on this? Like where do you think this
thank you, Marzia.
misinformation comes from?
Yeah, well, as Allison pointed out, people don't change their opinions. That's because they don't want to. The root cause of these myths are self-interest. People benefit from being able to demonize cotton. And so retailers and brands are trying to differentiate themselves from their competition, and they will talk about some identity cotton program they have going where they fund a few hundred hectares of organic cotton, say, and then import millions of pairs of jeans made of something else. The textile exchange certainly is a root source of many of these myths. Some NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund and the Environmental Justice Foundation also, and organic cotton has to justify its own inefficiencies. So whatever benefits it provides, there are also costs, and it has to justify those. And NGOs are always, of course, trying to encourage donations. If an NGO says there's no problem, then nobody's going to donate, and so they have to emphasize the negative, and that's really the root cause of where this started. And as Allison and Elizabeth pointed out, that social media can compound this, and the erosion of journalistic standards have made all this possible.
Thank you, Terry. And I think it's important to note that in the paper and throughout this work, we've tried to work with some of these NGOs to understand the intent and the reason why some of this misinformation was coming up. And I think maybe we'll touch upon it later on. And the question of intent was very tricky to discern, because some people just lack of technical expertise, and some people may have this intent of differentiate themselves unfairly from the competition. So I think it's a question that we still are struggling with. But Elizabeth, after writing this report, do you think that the narrative around cotton as well is, I mean, we touched on it briefly, but I wanted to dig deeper. Is it that much ill-informed? And what are the biggest myths about this industry?
Yeah, I actually would just to amplify what you were saying, Marzia, that it was very difficult with the paper to, we did trace the origins of all of these claims. But then from there, they kind of went into this cycle of misinformation where they would become more distorted over time, which is why the paper not only looks at how and where claims originate, if they're coming from an NGO, for example, because, to take the 20,000 liters of water claim, that's a claim that is just often, the numbers are transposed. We see lots of different variations of it. The same thing with the pesticide data claim. But I think for me, to go back to your question, I remember when I put out Overdressed, there was a lot of qualitative research in that book. And then by the time The Conscious Closet came out, there was so much more data about fashion. And at that time, I thought more data is good, right? And then as we say in the paper, there is this perception, journalists are definitely vulnerable to it, that data is objective and that it doesn't lie. Because what was so interesting about the findings in this paper is that we're not necessarily saying just replace this bad claim with this good, credible claim. Obviously, we do want people to do that, right? But it's also to take their skill level a step forward and understand how to use data in context, and understand that actually data can often leave a lot out, or it can even tell the wrong story about something. I think the 20,000 liters example is a powerful one, because how many liters of water cotton consumes per kilogram is not actually an indicator or a reliable indicator of environmental impact all the time.
Thank you. And I want to add on this question. So what are the things, Elizabeth, that surprised you the most in learning about by writing these reports?
I think I just went over it pretty well, again, we looked at there's so much to it, but the 20,000 liters claim, for example, we're not saying, we're not only saying, what we should do is replace that claim with, 1,931 liters of irrigated water. It's to understand why a global average like that is so misleading to begin with, because cotton is grown in 75 countries. There are, 22 million cotton farmers at least. Some cotton farmers use 0 liters of irrigated water. Some use 40,000 liters of rainwater. So when we use these global averages, they can be extraordinarily misleading, but I think that they also aren't telling the right story about the cotton industry. You really have to get into the nuances in local and regional data to start to really understand this industry and the sustainability of this industry.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to you to cover. And Terry, do you have anything to add to to what Elizabeth just said.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, despite all the negativity and the myths that are out there, consumers still have a positive impression of cotton, and that is both from panel data or surveys. And right now, cotton prices are surging to near record highs because of surging demand around the world. So it's especially true in producing countries. The people have a interest in cotton, but even in Europe and Asia.
But Terry, how important is that what we mentioned, like about the context? So like not using these global averages.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, in my career, I was fortunate enough to be able to travel everywhere from Argentina to Zimbabwe. I have the only major cotton producing country that I did not visit was Iran because of just visa issues. The government of Iran didn't. But yeah, they're tremendous, and even people tend to lump together smallholders. They talk about smallholders as if a smallholder in Bolivia is the same as a smallholder in Burkina Faso or something. You know, there are tremendous differences in crop rotations, soil types, water availability, input availability, what kind of seeds they have available to them. And yeah, and this is my biggest complaint with the HIG MSI, is that they just have a number, and that number is supposed to represent alpaca from Peru, one number for alpaca, one number for wool, one number for cotton, one number for nylon, and it's a very misleading impression that you can just assign global averages and make calculations, and if people disagree, well, you can argue over the life cycle analysis, but it can't be done that way.
Yeah, and so you, Terry, you're a statistician, am I right in saying that?
Yep.
Yeah, and you know quite a bit about numbers and how they could be distorted. So I wanted, when I interviewed, I remember that you shared with me some of the typical ways that number gets misused. Could you like talk us through maybe a few examples briefly?
Oh, there's so many. I forget which one we talked about. In terms of damage to the industry, the worst misuse that I see is people not using numbers at all, but instead substituting emotive or subjective language. So calling cotton a dangerous crop or a risky crop, or cotton is a thirsty crop. Yeah, there you go. So what is thirsty? Pineapples are thirsty, roses are thirsty, people are thirsty. You can't, what does it mean? How much is that? So that certainly is one of the dangerous things.
So it's an issue of framing these.
Framing is a term that you understand. I just think of it as the impression that is left in people's minds, that that it comes from these emotive phrases that people can grab onto. As Elizabeth said, they're not going to remember 1,192 liters. They're going to remember cotton's a thirsty crop, and so that's I think the most damaging thing. Another one is confusing or conflating correlation with causation. So the Aral Sea has been destroyed. Cotton has grown near the Aral Sea. Therefore, cotton destroyed the Aral Sea. That's not true. The Aral Sea was destroyed by Soviet mismanagement and inefficiency. Another one are farmer suicides in India. Farmers commit suicide. Farmers grow biotech cotton or GMO cotton. Therefore, GMO cotton caused these farmers to commit suicide. Again, every suicide is a tragedy, but for the millions of people involved, there is not an increase in suicides among cotton farmers. So these are the worst ways that statistics are used, manipulated, and mythologized, that get embedded in, as you say, framing, get embedded in the general consciousness, and that's where a problem comes.
And I think it's important, like with my experience with farmers, it's important that all stories and all countries and all localities are super different. So it's really important to have the local understanding on where cotton is grown, how, and what are the impact of growing it, and not oversimplifying into a correlation, causation, as you mentioned, or a global average. And yeah, so a question to all: how do we filter actually misleading versus credible and scientifically fact-supported claims? Allison, I wanted to have you on to answer this one first.
Related to what we were just discussing, it reminded me of an application of something like we just discussed why global averages don't work, and kind of an application of that and how we can kind of determine what's misleading and what's accurate is there's also not a lot of really decent global averages for other natural fiber alternatives. And so there's one example with hemp that I've seen used repeatedly, and the comparison is hemp grown in the lab in the UK and then a global average of cotton's water use. So we can't combine them. That doesn't make any sense. We would need to do cotton grown in the UK in the lab next to hemp grown in the UK in the lab. I've seen this study presented without investigating the underlying methodology in everything from brand marketing to more detailed papers from credible institutions. And I think that it comes from just a lack of knowledge and understanding of diving into and looking at the methodology. It's not as simple as checking the footnote. You have to read and deep dive into it. So I think that when you see something that is a particular comparative about something like water use between products, you have to think to yourself, okay, well, is the methodology the same? And how can I find out about the methodology? Was that posted somewhere? And some organizations and institutions will leave that trail available, but when it's used in brand marketing, it's not there. And I don't think that it necessarily comes from a bad place. I think brands don't necessarily have the fullest understanding of their value chain.
Thank you, Allison. I think this is super important. Briefly, Elizabeth, do you want to add anything to this? Because we have still a couple of questions I really want to get us covered.
I think that I would just say that to get us started going in the right direction, just acknowledging that fashion has a misinformation problem. If you come across a shocking statistic, even if it has been widely circulated, there's a decent chance that it is either obsolete, it's transposed from the original figure. Stop before you share it. And I think that, we were able to find the primary source in a few of the examples. I mean, with the 20,000 liters claim, which I keep bringing up, that one we found that it came from a 1999 report. And as we state in the paper, like, we shouldn't be using data that's 20 years old, right? So that's just like a simple takeaway from the paper, is like, not to just keep cycling and passing around misinformation. Yeah,
absolutely. And Terry, please.
I would add that as both Allison and Elizabeth have said, methodology is boring for most people. It's hard work, it's challenging, they're not going to do it. And so when you've got somebody in a marketing department for a brand and they come across a statement that reinforces the impression that they want to create, they use it. And that's how this stuff keeps cycling. I was going to echo what they've said in trying to combat these myths. Demand to see the source, and oftentimes they don't have a source. They heard it, somebody, a friend told them, or they read it somewhere. Well, where? Well, they don't remember. And So just as simple thing as that is, they make a statement that, hey, that sounds interesting. Where did you get it? And oftentimes you just go down a rabbit hole they don't know. And that just demanding the source would be certainly a first step society-wide with all of our problems in trying to correct. Yes.
Yeah, on this, Terry, actually, next week on the 18th, we're going to speak about responsible marketing and citizenship as well as anti-greenwashing legislation. I think hopefully in that panel, we'll also learn about some of the ways that citizens or consumers can call out on that, and also the way that CSR departments can collaborate with their marketing team in order to create solid claims that are actually truthful and reliable. So moving on, I wanted I know you touched upon it, Elizabeth, lightly before, but I wanted to ask you again, how have you changed your use of data and perception, how to use it and read it when you come across it?
Yeah, it's interesting because my first job, I interned at The Nation, which has a really rigorous fact-checking department. I went back and looked at the Conscious Closet to kind of see, how it compared to where I was as a journalist when I wrote Overdressed. And one thing that I noticed was there is an increase, I believe, in what Allison was calling tertiary sourcing. Over time, there just became like facts that were nested in reports, and then reports were linking back to other reports, and the primary source just got completely lost along the way. So one really easy thing that I have committed myself to after writing this paper is making sure I always go back, make an attempt to find the primary source. And to Allison's point, if it's something if it seems off or not, like going back and reading through that primary source, if it's not available, then we can't use it. I think the other thing, and someone was asking about this, is like thinking through this process of retraction, because there is like a lot of misinformation now circulating. So what are we all going to do publicly to say, okay, this fact was misused in this report. Are we going to correct it publicly? What is that going to look like? The example in our paper is Textile Exchange, like committing to remove the claim that organic cotton consumes 90%, saves 90% less water. And that's named in the paper as sort of an example of best practice, right? I could go on, but that is just some of the things that I'm thinking through now.
And on this, like, Allison, do you think there is a role for fact-checking to be more embedded in the fashion sustainability discourse? How do you see it?
I think that would be helpful if there was more fact-checking everywhere. I think that we will see a little bit of a transition over time, just because previously so much of what was put out about sustainability really was from a marketing perspective. And I think brands are becoming more savvy, hiring people with backgrounds in sustainability or environmental studies, and that we'll see a kind of an elevated level of discussion that has more nuance in it. I see it happening in beauty, but I haven't seen it to the same extent in fashion, where really the leaders are the ones who are distilling misinformation from fact.
Allison, what do you mean by beauty? You see it in beauty, you mean?
Sure. So like skincare products, for example, there's a lot of discussion that's getting into these deeper level nuances about like chemicals and different elements of the production.
Okay.
I see like a lot of really interesting questions from the audience. So I just let's maybe conclude our panel discussion and then go into the audience questions. So I wanted to ask around all of you, what are some of the tools that we could use to improve the way that we consume claims and data? I know, Elizabeth, you covered it quite a lot, but maybe if you can just like reiterate one by one what you think. Terry, can I start with you?
Thank you. Well, again, my perception is that the root cause is self-interest. People perpetuate these myths because it benefits them, and there is no cost to greenwashing today. As an example, Wrangler jeans at point of sale in Walmart says that they're saving 6 billion liters of water with this per year with this, and nobody is ever going to check a claim like that. And you know, it's just out there, they say it, and so there's no cost to misleading consumers. And for a lot of people are in the value chain who really are trying to say it's expensive, and so doing real sustainability has a cost. And so we've got to change the structure of incentives. I think the Transformers Ethical Council is a tool or a mechanism that may help do that by raising awareness of unethical behavior. But ultimately, I think it's got to be government regulation, because consumers are never going to be well enough informed that they can go into a store and choose this product over this product based on sustainability. It's just too complicated. And so ultimately,
government regulations and industry. I'm guessing some industry body. What we suggested in the paper was also that we hope that there's going to be an industry-wide fact-checking mechanism in the future. And I think we will keep an eye on what other organizations are doing, as well as taking some responsibility with Transformers in future activities, as you mentioned, Terry. Allison, what are some of the tools that we could use in order to improve the way that we consume claims and data?
I think that a great place to start is when you see a data point, a number, a figure, look it up. Can you find the primary source? If you see it in a newspaper, scroll down to the bottom and make sure there's not an errata and that the fact hasn't been, that this happens sometimes in fashion. I do see statistics that have been pulled, but the original article is still up with a note at the bottom that there's a correction. So really looking thoroughly at the sources that we're using. And if you want to do a deeper level dive, there are peer-reviewed studies to look at. You can always look up things like FTC violations if you want to get into the weeds of something like mislabeling that's been caught. So looking back to a trusted, reliable source to verify that information.
Thank you, Allison. Very important. Elizabeth?
Well, I mean, this paper is a tremendous resource. You know, I see a lot of people asking about, or I think I saw like, where can you get good data? Like I hope to see this approach taken for other sectors of the fashion industry, because we only vetted four cotton claims. There's so much more to debunk. But the paper is also in Marzia and Terry. I think that you should also explain how we chose the data that goes into the paper. Because what I found is that, yes, there are data gaps in fashion, but there is also a lot of good data that exists that is not being used, which was one of the missions of this report, was to get everything out from behind a paywall, get it out in the public domain, and put it all in one place together so that people can start to pull from credible recent data in place of misinformation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also, like, adding on to what you said, okay, so we decided to put data into context and also search for the best, most updated, reliable data we could find and make it public. And where it wasn't. So like a lot of data, as you mentioned, is behind paywalls. It's very hard to get by or afford. And so we worked with ICAC, which is the International Cotton Advisory Committee, and Terry is the former executive director of that committee. And they have, Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, but they pull their data from government sources. And so what we found is that is the most reliable and most up-to-date data that we could find on cotton. And it's normally, most of their data comes in an annual report, which is called the Cotton Data Book. We've pulled and we work with them to make the most relevant data public, because normally is for purchase. And so that's how we worked in order to put out their claims that are actually reliable and credible. And on top of it, what I would say is that we've identified how misinformation works through what we call it erratic copying, irresponsible framing, mythic proportions, and Elizabeth, there's another way that it gets distorted. But by understanding how data and claims can actually be distorted, you can be conscious about it, and I think you can put mechanism in place to stop that. But we have 7 minutes left for Q&A of the audience, and I think we have quite a few questions that are super interesting. So let's get started on this first one that I can see through. I have a question for Terry. The use of comparison data by identity cotton programs comparing with control farmers claim reduction of pesticides, fertilizers, and water. What is your view on this, and would baseline be a better method?
Well, rigorously conducted controlled studies of side-by-side comparisons are valid, and I wish there were more of them. Unfortunately, most of those studies are not published, or it's hard to get the data, or they refer to only a very small, up to a few thousand hectares at most of cotton in one place or another. Certainly the world cotton industry could benefit from the broad scale collection of standardized data. And we found, certainly with pesticide use, it's very difficult to get data on pesticide use by individual countries. And but having baseline data would be helpful if it existed, but it doesn't. So relying on these side-by-side studies is the second best option. The biggest identity cotton is BCI, Better Cotton Initiative. They do not publish their studies purporting to show farmer benefit. You can go on their website, they're not there. And you sit behind paywalls and things. So I wish they, if those studies are done, I wish they were publicized and we could all read them and see what goes on.
Thank you, Terry, for this. And actually, this leads very well on to the second question by Catherine. Sources behind paywalls, thoughts. Elizabeth, we found that there were a lot of, especially on the pesticide data, there were a lot of really, really good data that we could have accessed. However, it was behind a huge paywall. We're talking about marketing, usually is market research agencies collecting the data on pesticides from the agrochemical industry. To purchase these databases around 80,000 or more. Some do not want to disclose even if you pay this amount, you cannot disclose this data publicly. You can use it only for your private own use, and some of these companies would not agree to share the data with how do you say, either NGOs or advocacy groups, etc. So they select who they would share the data with. So For me, it's a huge problem, the paywalls of data, especially on the pesticide sector, on the pesticide issue. And but yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Elizabeth.
I agree. For those who've read through the report, you can see a difference in the data where we were able to collect and share about cotton's water consumption versus the pesticide data that's available. We have global sales data for pesticide usage, and then we have on a national level total pesticide usage, I believe also as a percentage of market share or also sales data. And what we found was that my understanding is that there is national level data in many places about what pesticides are being used, but that data is not in the public domain. And that is one of the calls to action that we name in the paper, is that we do think that data should be publicly available, and maybe industry groups can get together and purchase it. It's certainly a data gap that needs to be filled.
I'd add that data you're talking about, it's usually not specific to any one crop. So for Togo, you can get data on how much pesticide, how much herbicide, insecticide is imported by Togo.
Yeah.
And I've seen people who then report that number as the amount of pesticide used on cotton in Togo, and it's not. It's the total. So, and Togo is just one very small example. So, it's getting accurate data for cotton by country is a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking through the questions. I see that, Catherine, you asked this one. I am in the financial industry where, frankly, numbers are our language. What I know is that data is open to interpretation. How do you manage the line between a different interpretation that not everyone agrees with, and misinterpretation? I don't know, who wants to take this one?
I'll just say briefly, if people are using accurate data and they wish to interpret it one way, and they provide the context of how they got to that, I think that's fine. The problem is people don't use any data at all, or they use wrong data, and they do that because they have a preconceived result that they want, and they find data to reinforce that. So they don't start at the bottom and say, what's the truth? They start at the end and look for data or claims to support that. So again, what's the source? As both Allison and Elizabeth have said, tracking it back, but that's hard work, and most people just don't do it.
I think we have only time for one more question, and then maybe one last thought. I wanted to cover this one. In government studies, such as the EPA, which focuses on the US only, how does one account for borderless environmental impacts, such as water and air? I'm looking at Elizabeth. I don't know if you have.
I mean, I think, if you've read the paper, you know that we're trying to just get the best credible current data out into the open, and show people how to use it in context. That is the aim of this paper. It is not comprehensive to all of, to every problem in cotton, to every data challenge in cotton, but the paper has a very clear mission, which is to provide public free access to current data that we've deemed to be credible and encourage people to use. And then from there, just show people how to use data critically and in context. So I'm dodging that question because I think that it's sort of outside of the scope of what we were aiming to achieve.
Thank you. Well, I think we are right on the clock. So I don't know if we have maybe just one final comment for the round, and then we say goodbye, and hope everybody learned something on this panel. Elizabeth, do you want to go with one final thought?
Yeah, I'll just answer Rosalinda's question. I think that we're not saying that scientists are the only ones qualified to use good data. One of the points of the paper is to educate the public and everyone in the fashion industry on how to vet claims, to put all data, best available data on water and pesticides in one place. And we just encourage people to use the report. And yeah, that's my final thought.
Thank you. Allison and Terry, quickly. I know we're over time, but I wanted to get the chance to have your final comments.
I have just a 2-word final comment, or 3-word. Self-interest and incentives. That is those are the things that have to change if we're ever going to root out the misperceptions and these myths that keep going around and around and around.
Great, thank you, Terry. Allison?
I would say look it up. If you see something that's a number that's in any kind of a publication and they don't explain where it came from, just look it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for each and one of you to share all your expertise. I wanted to say to all the ones that stayed on the line for these 2 extra minutes, we have a second panel next week on the 18th about anti-greenwashing legislation, responsible marketing and citizenship. And we hope that in that one, we dig deeper into what are some of the mechanisms that legislations have, and like furthermore learn how to really be critical consumers of data. Thanks everybody. It was really lovely to see that everybody stayed, like a lot of people stayed online, and thank you for your time.